Hi everyone, Spencer Pauly here with Tim Clauser, the Eastern Washington reporter for the Center Square. Now, Tim, you recently wrote an article on the Spokane City Council voting to replace Mayor Lisa Brown's camping ban, and you say it's essentially unenforceable. Now, this vote comes despite ideological differences among the city council members. To start, let's just go ahead and go into it. Could you just walk us through the newly passed law and how we got to this point right here?
Yeah, Spencer, this is pretty much the third camping ban that the city of Spokane has had in the last years. And when you say unenforceable, I was speaking to the Mayor Lisa Brown's prior camping ban, the one that the city council just replaced this week. Now, prior to that, let's go all the way back to April and before then. In 2023, 75% of voters just around passed a voter or a ballot initiative put forth by the voters saying, hey, we don't want any public camping within 1,000 feet of a school park or daycare. Now, it was kind of unenforceable at the time until some federal Supreme Court decisions overturned lower rulings allowing police to enforce this law back in June of 2024. So the SPD was enforcing it for several months until April of this year, when the state Supreme Court came in and said, look, this should have never been on the ballot in the first place. We're striking it down. But in doing so, the Supreme Court provided the city council an opportunity to reinstate them law themselves with a majority vote. Now, the two-member conservative minority tried to do that a few times, but the Council of Progressive Majority ultimately refused to support those efforts, leading to the mayor's camping ban, which they passed in June. Now, when they did this, the business community and the conservative minority argued that it didn't have enough teeth, and Police Chief Kevin Hall pretty much said as much just a few weeks ago when giving his 90-day review to the city council. He said in the few months since they passed the law, his officers hadn't issued a citation or service referrals to anyone that they had contacted. And on top of that, the language that was included in this ordinance prevented his officers from tracking who they were stopping. So they couldn't tell if they were stopping the same people over and over and over again. And essentially the camping ban, it was citywide, but it allowed people to avoid citations if they accepted services, hence the zero service referrals, or they could just walk away. They didn't have to do anything. They could just walk out of eyesight, and then that would be considered the end of the contact, and an officer would have to go back to that new location and say, look, you're going to get a ticket if you don't leave or accept services. And they could just say, no, thanks, walk around the corner. 30 seconds later, you have the same thing. So the chief essentially called it unenforceable and said that they needed to make some changes. And those changes were proposed officially Monday of this week. I got a draft last Friday and reported on it. But the council fast-tracked the ordinance as an emergency measure and voted unanimously, surprisingly, to pass this ordinance on Monday night, ushering in a new era for the city where it seems like with the provisions in this camping ban, officers will have the discretion to enforce regardless. I mean, it still directs SPD to offer service referrals, but they aren't required to do so, nor are they prohibited from issuing a citation if that person walks away.
So Mayor Brown's original version, were these flaws identified when they were first announced, or was that an issue going in?
Yeah, they knew this was going to be an issue, or at least some of them knew it was going to be an issue and tried to tell their peers, and their peers pushed back and said, look, we really want to emphasize the connection to services here. And you know, that's an applaudable goal, but at the same time, you do have to enforce the rule of law. And that's what the conservative minority and a bunch of businesses have said in the months following the passage back in June, that's just really deteriorated, that camping, open air drug use has gotten worse downtown, and that now business owners are left grappling with the council's inaction.
Okay. And you said you were talking about the conservative minority pushing to revive the 2023 voter approved ban multiple times. Now, you touched on that, but can you go more in depth about why they failed and what changed this time around? How do we get from there to here at this exact moment leading up to the general election, which I think is kind of important?
Yeah. So at the time, this law, they referred to it as Prop 1, the one that voters approved in 2023. The voters saw it as, this is the will of the people. We passed this. You should respect that we passed this. Even if the state struck it down, you have a duty to serve the people. In the council majority, they argued otherwise. They said, look, there's issues with enforcing this policy in the first place. Some of them said if anything related to homelessness was on the ballot, people probably would have passed it. But they said, look, the community is looking for different solutions. Now, that wasn't what we were hearing at a lot of the council meetings. A lot of people wanted them to reinstate Prop 1. And the conservative minority, they attempted to reintroduce the proposal a few different times at the committee level, I believe, in other settings, but that requires a majority support. And there's only 2 members on the minority compared to the 5 members representing the council majority. So without some bipartisan support, they're not going to get that law through, which is ultimately what we saw. So instead, they came to this compromise, coincidentally, a week or 2 ahead of the election, and it happened to get unanimous support.
Okay. So with Spokane, Bingle, and the District 2 seat all on the ballot, I'm curious to see how the unanimous approval reshaping the campaign narrative in the final days leading up to the general election on November 4th. Where is the current landscape right now with these political races in Spokane?
Yeah, I think it's probably safe to say we're going to see a pretty tight race, at least in Zapone's challenge from Christopher Savage, a pretty outspoken community advocate. And then for District 2, which would be Councilmember Paul Dillon's seatmate, you have Kate Tellis, which is a former prosecutor, but aligns more with the majority, going up against Alejandro Barrientos, who is more of a Democrat centrist, but aligns more with the conservative minority. I think these races are going to be pretty close, but the issue of the camping ban was weighing a lot on these races in the weeks leading up. And ultimately, we have the election in just over a week, maybe a week now. But it was weighing on the voters. A lot of people wanted to see the council reinstate this law, and the Spokane Business Association and other groups were asking these candidates saying, look, will you reinstate the will of the people? Or are you going to continue with the current status quo? And I think that's something that Zapone and the people running in District 2 really wanted to clarify. Now Bingle, he committed to reinstating that law to these groups. And he did so in a sense with this new version because it does maintain some of the same language as Prop 1. But I think Zapone and the others were feeling the pressure. I think that might have led to them really wanting to fast track this ahead of the election.
Now, Tim, you quote both the Downtown Spokane Partnership and Greater Spokane Incorporated in support of the bill, but you also note that Catholic Charities added the caveat that the ban isn't a complete solution. So what services do shelter providers say they're still missing to make this ban workable?
Well, I mean, if you look back to even just a year ago today, the city was getting ready to close its largest congregate shelter. And ultimately in doing so, it took hundreds of shelter beds off of the system. And the city has brought some of those back with the scattered site shelters, this model that the mayor has really pushed, but it's only around 200 or so beds compared to the 500 or 600 lost by closing that larger shelter. So I think a lot of these service providers would argue, look, the bed count isn't high enough, in that there just needs to be more services in general, more detox services and such. But there also comes the issue with siting the facilities because a lot of people don't want those things in their backyard, along with the impacts that come with these services. But that's kind of a mission that the Downtown Spokane Partnership, Greater Spokane Incorporated, Catholic Charities, and all these other organizations are trying to solve with this new regional task force that also went underway at the end of last month or at the beginning of this month. And the goal with that task force is to come back with a proposal to fund facilities like this, including a new jail potentially. And they plan to return with those recommendations, I believe, by next spring.
These are all issues I think we're seeing all over Washington state. This is what I cover, trying to find that balance between getting people the services they need, but also just addressing the public safety issue that arises with homelessness, right? And so there is this lack of behavioral health services, shelters, any kind of supportive housing for these people in need. And so that's something that we see in Spokane, something we see in Seattle, and all over in between. So, Tim, my last question to you here is, so this ordinance now gives police officers discretion, and it still emphasizes referrals, but I'm curious, once the political heat cools, what metrics could residents look for to see if this is actually moving the needle in addressing homelessness? Is it just passing the eye test, seeing a lack of visible homelessness on the streets? What are your thoughts?
Well, they did bake in some reporting requirements into the proposal before passing. So I believe SPD will return to the council maybe quarterly or somewhere around there to provide updates on enforcement and how the service referrals and everything are going. So the council will be tracking this moving forward. It's not like they're just passing the policy and saying, look, let's see where things go from here. But I think you do bring up a good point in that a lot of the criticism in the last year has been around visible homelessness. And a lot of people correlate with low or little to no enforcement of the prior camping bans to the rise in visible homelessness. And at the same time, you got to look at this and say, look, even if they're issuing citations to every homeless person they see on the street, unless they have outstanding warrants for, say, violent or more, other offenses that might necessitate a larger police response, these people aren't going to jail. They're going to get a citation. They're going to go through maybe a therapeutic court or a lower level court, and they're going to be right back out on the street. So the citations doesn't really alleviate the visible homelessness. It might push it to other parts of the city where it's less visible, whether that be the other neighborhoods or under viaducts and such. But it really is going to be the ability to get these people into services that really, I think, will move the needle in the long run. So when Catholic Charities says this isn't the complete solution, I think that makes sense. And I think it's just something that, this camping ban is a big part of the equation, but it's only one part of the equation that the council will need to consider moving forward as they continue to address the homelessness crisis there.
Well, our readers and our viewers will be updated with your coverage, your continued coverage of this, Tim. So thanks for taking the time to talk about this, and looking forward to future stories. This is Spencer Pauly. Thanks for watching. See you next week.